I just want to welcome you all to WIT. I believe it's the 6th year, and for some of you that don't know or haven't been here before, it stands for Women's Intelligence Trust. This conference every year is about change, it's about what's new, it's about things that actually I'm interested in, because I have to organize it. And you know, it's really about how technology is going to change your life, affect your health, and ultimately your finances also. And I want you to be really think about what you're doing today. So the idea is to get outside your normal box. They are organized, believe it or not. They're color-coded, and I know everybody gets lost, but that's part of the fun. It's kind of like being at Burning Man with no signs. If you look at the green room, which is the far left, that's the finance room. And we've got we have the first speaker, of course, which is a combination of finance and technology. We're going to be learning about big data. If some of you don't know, we've got Signal Labs here. And then we also have JP Morgan's been very nice, and Samantha's come out all the way from New York. We have people from all over the place. People flew in from London last night, Hong Kong, New York, LA. I mean, people are from all over the place. So thank you all for flying in and being here, because we're going to have a lot of fun. And then the middle section is the blue room, the chart room, known as the technology room. And the last room is the pink room, which is women's health. And UCSF has been a partner of mine for years. Dr. Nina Gates, who I had lunch with this week, isn't here, but she's always been a great sponsor. At the end of the day, if you guys can stay for drinks, I know some people have to do carpool pickup or geriatric pickup, whatever it is. But at 3:30, we do have red wine and drinks, and we're also going to have some homespun companies that make all kinds of things. And the Gigi Kaufman's been very generous. She's got some beautiful jewelry she's made. 15% of those proceeds are going back to UCSF for their women's health support for that organization. So we have a lot of very interesting doctors there. I always try to combine the typical historical medical field with a little bit of the woo-woo. So we have a couple woo-woos. I'll let you figure it out. Okay, let's keep moving here. I just want to talk a little bit about not the history of this organization, but the color orange, which was one of the reasons there's an orange theme here. Orange is a color that, when you look at the psychology of it, has to do with your gut reaction. And I think one of the things that happens in this day and age is we're all so involved and everything's moving so fast. I mean, our generation had 45 seconds of attention. The millennials have about 17 seconds, and the digitals are down to 7. So our attention span is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and we can't focus. And I come from a family of people with ADD to begin with. And so listening to your gut reaction is really important, and cultivating that and making sure you're in touch with it. So orange represents your gut reaction, and the color orange, it offers emotional strength in difficult times. It helps balance and helps you come back from disappointments and despair. It helps you recover from grief. I know I'm going on about orange. Orange is optimistic. It's uplifting. You should think about the color orange every day. It's a way to sort of energize your day, create spontaneity, have a positive outlook, and it also helps you relate to adventure, take risk-taking, inspire, create confidence and independence. So enough with the orange. Think about the Buddhists, right? That's the color of their robes, and that's for a reason. So I'm going to take a few minutes quickly now and just go through some trends that happened in the last year, and then we're going to talk about current trends. And we've picked some very specific trends for the big data. Obviously, I'm making fun of the politicians that we are being entertained by. I once said that if Kim Kardashian's rear was running for president, she would get elected this year. And of course, that has so much to do with social media and how things are working in this day and age. Let's start and go backwards a little bit. One of the major themes in the last year has been the US dollar, in case you hadn't noticed. We've got, it hit a high a couple months ago, and there's a lot of things that have been happening in the markets because of that. One, of course, is the trade deficit situation's improved. We've got more people traveling overseas. Their Americans are all over Europe, in case anybody's interested in going this summer. And the US dollar is at a very, very strong point in time. It has started to come down recently in the last 5 weeks, which is good. We've also seen stabilization. If you remember, in August, the Chinese floated the yuan, which was a catastrophe because we were just about to raise interest rates, and they kind of slapped us over that. And then the currency devaluation occurred with the yuan, which pulled down the emerging markets. So that's starting to come back. China's just started to stabilize, which is great. We had huge catastrophe with oil prices. We've been through this before, but this is actually very similar to 73, 74, except that we have too much production of oil. Just the opposite, which is Kim from school. I haven't seen you so long. Anyway, which is just the opposite of what happened in 73, 74, where we had lack of supply. And the oil price is really interesting. This time, when you look at the consumer, in December, there was $537 in everybody's pocket. And they usually spend it, and that usually stimulates the consumer. This time, the millennials decided that they were going to buy monster drinks, salty snacks, and games. And so there was a huge flood there. The other thing that's been happening when you look at the consumer and the history of the consumer in the United States, usually that's an impetus to start seeing them spend. And they are starting to spend, but it's a different way of spending. We're seeing giant trucks being purchased. We're seeing huge flows there, and people are still saving. There's sort of a hangover from the last recession, if you will. And the American public is now saving more money than they have since the 1960s. They're putting it away, and the millennials, who are going to save our bacon, by the way, ladies, are the people that will start to spend, and they're getting closer. They're going to be one of the largest movements of consumerism that we've ever seen. And when we see it happen, they will finally start to buy homes and stop sharing couches, and we'll actually see them make a big difference. And I'm really excited about this age group because we've done such a good job, right? But they're passionate about what they do. They want to change the environment, and everything's going to hopefully coalesce. Maybe there'll be a revolution. I don't know. I mean, if you think of what's going on with Bernie Sanders, socialism is exactly my bag of tea, but there's such a separation right now between the haves and have-nots. Something's got to give. All right, that's my bandwagon on that. And oil's very important. I mean, the fact that the Saudis actually threatened us with flooding the markets 2 weeks ago and selling our treasuries if we release the 15 names from 9/11 is a big deal. So there's all this uproar and all this change that's going on everywhere, and change is good. You have to keep remembering that, and not be stifled by bombs going off in funny places, because the reality is you're probably not going to be there, and fear is not the thing that you want to be running your life with. All right, I'm going to stop. I have lots of other things. We talk about the consumerism and the millennials. I'm going to actually get going because we're behind time. The only thing I'm going to leave with real quickly is the probability of everybody in this room reaching 80. And a couple has the likelihood of reaching 80. It's 89% of the population, okay? We know we're aging, right? If you're a single woman, the likelihood of you reaching 80 is 72%. And if you're a single man, you guys better get married again. Single man only has a 62% chance. So it's healthy for guys to be married, right? Now, to reach 90 years of age, 47% chance of reaching 90 are, again, married couples. Single women are at 33%, and men are at 21%. So we know we're going to outlive the men, generally speaking. So make sure you're prepared for that and understand what that means. Make sure that you're ready for that ability to live longer, take care of your health, take care of your finances, and keep your brain working. So I'm going to do the introductions now for Samantha and Tammy. You guys want to come up here, and I'll move my whole thing out of the way. And then while you're at it, this book's great if you haven't read it. If you have read it, give it to somebody else who is as messy as I am. Messiness is a sign of intelligence, I've told everybody. And that's why I have all these wonderful people, and I want to thank the people who have worked so hard from my office. Where are they? Ashley? Where are you, Ash? There she is. Ashley Krieger's back there. Margaret Lamb, stand up. Will Whittington, Milo Gates, Roger Gallagher, everybody's had a hand in this. This is a little bit of a hand, homespun. I can't move this thing. Homespun. Yeah, why don't you come help me? That'd be great. Thank you. Effort by everybody. And there's a reason. I mean, I spoke at the Lean On conference last year, actually right after Hillary, which was, really sweat making. And there were 5,000 people in the audience. And the good news was I could only see 2 rows out, right? The bad news was they moved me from 8:30 to 2:30, and I felt like that somebody had really given me the short sheet. And when she's so professional, she's got, all these wonderful people around her. She's scripted beautifully. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? Nobody's going to pay attention to me. And I got out and I started telling jokes. So, maybe that sense of humor is lacking there somewhere. Anyway, so I just want to quickly make the introduction. I'm going to read off the script for a second, which I generally don't do because I can't remember everything at this age. Lack of memory is a good thing. It makes you forget and realize that every day is a new day. So, Samantha is a vice president and is at JP Morgan. They're fiddling with this, so I'll just keep saying things. This is Samantha in the green. She joined JP Morgan. It's not Morgan Stanley. Remember, I play with everybody. Joined JP Morgan in 2015. She worked at Bank of America Merrill Lynch in wealth management and multi-asset investment strategies and with the chief investment office. She's very, very smart. I did a due diligence meeting with JP Morgan a few months ago, and was very lucky to meet her and have her come all the way out from New York. She works in the CME group as an economist. I mean, isn't she an attractive economist? For God's sakes, we need more women economists. Things wouldn't be so screwed up if we had more women economists. And she has a master's degree in economics from NYU, and with a concentration in one of my favorite topics, econometrics, okay? And then next to her is Tammy Presser, and she's currently the VP of Customer Relations and Customer Success. Excuse me, they use different words now. Customer Success at Zigna Labs. She has a bachelor's degree in International Relations, a minor in Spanish, and her coursework was in economics, financial accounting, political science, conflict negotiation, we all know that's important, and statistics at none other than Stanford University. So we have some very smart people. Everybody in this group is smart, and that's the whole idea, is to share your brain power. So I think Samantha's going to start first, and I'm going to give you the mic because I talk too much. Thank you so much.
What we thought we would do is, thank you, integrate big data with what we're seeing in the market. So I wanted to talk about the U.S. economy, some longer run trends we're seeing that I want to get on everyone's radar. I feel like I'm doing a little bit of a public service announcement about U.S. growth. Then we're going to talk about international. Theo mentioned oil, mentioned China. We're going to talk about those, so do a little bit of around the globe. And then for the last part, we're going to come back home and talk about 2 things that I think are used as political weapons. And what I mean by that is the state of the labor market, the real state of the labor market, and the federal debt. Because we are in an election year. Are we ever? And we think these 2 things are really going to come up. Candidates use them in different ways, and you can slice and dice the data. So I kind of want to give you our unbiased view of what we really see so you're better informed about that. So talking about the US to start. Really simple. On the left-hand side, we just have GDP growth. And I want to do a little bit of history and then talk about what we're seeing going forward. So if you go back to 1965, trend growth in the US was about 3%. We were a 3% growth economy. You go back to 1950, that trend growth is even higher. We were actually a 3.5% growth economy. And normally what happens when you hit a recession is you fall off a cliff from a growth perspective, then you pop back up above trend and then fall back to trend. And that's, without fail, happened every single expansion except for this time. So that's what this lower light blue line is. So the average growth rate since 2008 has been 2%. That's a whole 1.5 percentage points lower. And that's why I think in the media, you hear a lot of people talking about how the US economy is not really growing, right? Are we still in a recession of some kind? What's going on? The truth is that it has to do with the long run forces of growth. And what we see going forward is that we're not a 3% economy. We're not a 3.5% economy. We're closer to 1.5. And I'm going to explain why. And it's a little bit more benign than I think I initially realized. There's a reason we're growing slower, which I will talk about in a second, but I just want to show you with one more graphic. So here we have strength of economic expansions going back to 1948. And obviously one of these things is not like the others, right? So this is This group here is going back to 1948. This is what every expansion has looked like. This light blue line is us now, right? So this is, I would say, significant. It's not just a one-off. This is more of our trend growth. This has been 2%, and we think it's going to be a little lower going forward. So why? Why do we see that? And then we're going to get to Signal. So kind of economic fundamentals. Across time, across countries, there has always been two sources of long-run growth. The first is growth in the labor force. That's a derivative of population growth. And if you think about that, it makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? So think about all the women and men in this room. If we doubled that amount, you have more of the virtuous consumption circles happening, right? More people spending money, having kids, buying homes, and that's a source of growth. One that we've relied on quite robustly because we've had a growing population and we had a huge influx of immigrants. So what do those demographics look like now? Well, we know the baby boomers are rolling off out of the workforce, even though we look at a lot of data on this, they're not retiring. That's not what we're seeing. We're just seeing different forms of work, not traditional, either part-time, consulting, not how you would traditionally measure the labor force. So that's happening. And at the same time, the birth rates come down a lot. So this is growth in the working age population by decade. And just focus on the light blue forecast from 2015 to 2024. It's expected to be 0.4%. This is the slowest it's been in 60 years. So our workforce isn't growing. How can you grow the workforce? Well, Japan hit this problem 20 years ago. You can either try to increase your birth rate, which is very hard when women are, receiving more education, working, all that sort of good stuff. The second is immigration, which we will talk about in a second. We're going to talk about public sentiment around immigration because I know it's a thorny issue, but it's a long-run source of growth if you can bring in immigrants and assimilate them properly. So that's the only way we're actually going to be able to fix the one side of the equation for long-run growth, which is labor force or population growth. And the second has to do with productivity. So productivity is that second force for long-run growth. And it's really interesting to be in a place as innovative as San Francisco and say that I'm not actually referring to Twitter or Facebook, which I don't have either of those, but I'm not referring to any of that. It's actually an economic construct when we talk about productivity. So it's output per worker per hour. Can we make more stuff in an hour with the same amount of resources? And you look at that, and that's been coming down dramatically decade over decade. There's a few drivers of productivity growth, including R&D spending, IT spending, and investment in structures, or CapEx. And up on the screen right now, we just have growth in structures and equipment. This is one form of CapEx. So it's been very cyclical, but we would say it's been much lower than it should have been, given how much we fell in the recession. Right, so the recession did such a number on the economy, we would have expected a much higher pop in capital expenditures by companies, and we're not seeing it. So there's a lot of research being done around this, which is super interesting by a lot of really smart people trying to figure this out. But this is a longer run issue and something that governments are probably going to have to be involved in terms of picking up productivity. So really quickly, just to kind of see it a little bit holistically, I mentioned the two drivers of GDP growth. This is by decade. So this is 55 to 65. This is where we are now. Blue is growth in workers. Gray is growth in productivity. And you can see it's come down quite dramatically. So what are the implications, though, for everyone in this room that I'm telling you we see lower long-run growth? Well, with lower long-run growth probably comes lower interest rates, right? Because if you're growing at 1.5, you don't need a 10-year treasury at 5%. Plus, you just wouldn't get there with inflation. So Theo mentioned, right, longevity, which we know is even escalating year by year. So in our view, smart investments is one, but we would actually say save more, spend less, kind of underpins this view. That's what we're telling clients. So I mentioned immigration. I'm going to pause there and let Tammy actually show you some really cool real-time data.
Tammy Presser here with Signal Labs. We talk about big data, we talk about data analytics, insights, real time, up to the second, all these sort of big flashy words. And Signal Labs is, you know, I credit us in one sense for both the liability and the benefit of using those types of words. When we talk about big data, we're looking at all these different types of sources. How are people actually looking at the information that's coming at us and then being able to extrapolate that into something bigger than itself? In Signal Labs, I've been there about a little over a year now. We've been sort of playing around with the notion of how do we explain to people, to customers, things that they're actually already telling us about. So oftentimes we're talking to large brands, Fortune 500 companies, as well as political candidates, political campaigns, et cetera. And they're telling us, look, I have so many different pieces of information, I don't know what to do with this. Or sometimes they're saying, I think I have a very solidified idea of what I need to move forward with because of the data that I've been receiving. And sometimes that's looking at a fraction of what really is happening as part of that conversation around X person, X brand, the umbrella brands around something like a PepsiCo. But what we've done is really try to bring that information and harness it down to something that is easy to look at, gives people the right sort of analytics, and can also really help change behavior and drive different sorts of decision making. Sam and I were talking a second ago just about the difference in our presentations and even looking at data points, right? And it'll take a number of days or weeks to put together a beautiful graph that I'm fascinated by everything Samantha's talking about because it's foreign to me, even coming from an international relations background. At the same time, I can look at things like this and I start to play around with the types of information that our company is bringing. Excuse me, because I've had a little bit of trouble with some of these things. But we're bringing up to the moment information around, I'll come back to the immigration one here. Oh, sure. Sorry. So, excuse me. Let's see if these things are working. Having a little bit of technical difficulty, but I've got some other windows here. Great. So this is what I look like. And excuse me if there are any foul words on here, again, because we're trying to provide a full a full view of what's going on without filtering information down. When I look at immigration, this was just looking at what we've done is we've built what we call sort of Boolean search profiles on the back end with our platform. And we're saying bring in everything that has to do with border security, immigration reform, some of these big hot button words, as well as, you know, everyday conversations that people are having around the notion of immigration. And to Samantha's point, there's a lot going on, especially being fueled by the political campaigns and debates and whatnot, that's helping to keep this not only relevant, but also just watching the different trends that happen as you look at some of the real-time data, and you'll see that in this top box over here. Just looking at the last 30 days, you'll notice from a media breakdown perspective, and some of my icons aren't coming through, but we've had over 2 million mentions that are just talking about immigration. That's coming from not only the social sphere of Twitter, of Facebook, et cetera, but also New York Times, Washington Post, what's happening from a broadcast and TV perspective. Also looking at information around news and blogs and social video. So people are really talking about this, whether you're part of that conversation or not. What we're trying to do is grab all that information together and make it available to, again, whether it's government and they're looking at where they should be positioning from an operations perspective and want to know what is the impact of trying to go into X or Y foreign country, or trying to even get certain, you know, if you're a large Fortune 100 company and you're trying to think about, should I go back into Mexico and build my next factory over there? Should I be looking at other places? What is the sentiment around those types of things? Or even as simple as, you know, Pepsi, again, trying to sell their, whether it's a Monster can of high energy soda or any other type of consumer packaged good product, what is the impact that immigration is having on the way that I should be selling, whether it's, you know, we'll use the Coke example of Coke versus Mexican Coke, right? Sugar versus corn syrup. Things as simple as that, and how they change the sorts of behavior and the way that they position and market their products based off of that impact on, you know, influx of immigration and the notions around that. What we're looking at down here, my information isn't quite as real time as it should be, but you start to look and even see in the recent stories area, we're pulling in again things from that are being tweeted, retweeted, et cetera, and you'll start to see that a lot of that information is still being driven by political candidacy right now. So Cruz says something, Trump says something, everybody decides they want to retweet that, and part of what we're doing again is trying to give a real quick impact of how quickly is that information coming to us, and then how quickly can someone respond or act to that, on that.
Next, we're going to talk global. My data feels like dinosaur data compared to Tammy's. This is the coolest data set we have, so I wanted to explain it to you. And it's survey-based, and it's not real time, and we get it once a month, and it gets revised for 6 months after that, every month. But we like this. This is a way to look at the globe. It's PMI data, Purchasing Managers Index, and I just want to explain how we get it. It's a neat job, and if you are a purchasing manager and you're not good at it, you'll be let go. So if you're a purchasing manager in a iPad factory, you have to forecast demand for iPads, how many iPads are going to need to be where at the end of the month. You then bring in all the supply. You have to make sure you have all the chips, all the workers, and you have to match demand with supply. So this company goes and surveys 8,000 purchasing managers in each country and asks them, are they expanding? Are they hiring? What do orders look like? Do they feel optimistic? And then we narrow it down to one number that gets revised 6 times. But this is PMI data for the globe, and this is how we look at what's going on around the world. So we talked about the US. Moving a little bit more internationally, again, like Theo mentioned, right? You hear headlines from different places. You hear bombs going off, and we tend to assume that things aren't going well around the world. From a growth perspective, we are not in a global recession, but we're moderately growing, and that's what you see here. So green means better, expansionary. Red and yellow means contractionary. And up here we have the developed markets. Right here is Europe in the middle, and then the bottom is emerging markets. So what's really interesting right now is that normally different parts of the world have tended to move in sync from a business cycle perspective, or generally in sync. Again, really different post-2008. This time around, different parts of the world, I would say, are very much out of sync from a business cycle perspective. So we've got the US and Canada and the UK up here, had been predominantly green. Europe is behind the US, we would say basically 5 years from a business cycle perspective. And then emerging markets are not doing well, right? And emerging markets, many of them have tipped into recession. So you can see that with the red and the yellow down here. And what's really interesting about this is going back 2 years. If I was to show this back to 2010, Europe was all red. So there's been a lot of improvement in Europe, we would say since maybe beginning of 2014. This was all red before. You just have to trust me because I don't have it up here. But the idea is that parts of the world are growing, but slowly, but not to the point of recession. And I want to talk about a few headwinds and then end with trade, and then we'll go back to Signal. I want to talk about China, just because China's a little bit black box, I think, to many people. I think it's a fascinating place. I want to give you our view on China, which it's not the JP Morgan approved view, but it has to do with the Communist Party, okay? So we'll get to that in a second, but what's been going on with China? On the left-hand side, we've got their growth rate. And this is growth rate going back to 2008, and you can obviously see it's been trending down. They grew at 10% for 2.5 decades. They are now growing closer to 7%. We get pushback on these numbers that people don't believe them. We need a Signal dashboard on Chinese growth, like real time. So a lot of people don't believe these numbers. We're in that camp where we don't quite believe them either. We don't think China's growing at 7. We think China's growing probably closer to 5. But I would say that's still an incredible growth rate. I'm not going to knock on China for growing at 5% when we're growing at 2. So regardless if you believe these numbers, we just think there's a trend down, maybe a little bit steeper than what the real data, the data they give us implies. But at the heart of it, though, our view on China is predicated on the Communist Party. So if I'm looking at China through this lens, the idea is that China has one goal and one goal only, and that is for the Communist Party to stay in power. How do they do that? Well, first of all, they have to keep the living standards of Chinese citizens increasing enough year to year to kind of squash, I would say, any unrest. And how they do that is by making sure that their economy grows every year. So I'm not worried about China from a perspective of taking over or trying to displace the US. I do think there's room for two superpowers. Right now in the markets, for a very long time, everything, I would say, orbited around the US, right? We had the US and everything in the market kind of circled around that to some degree. Now I would say it's a little bit more by orbit, right? China and the US and everything in the market is going to evolve around those two things. I think China's priorities do lie with their domestic situation. So everything that they do is going to be fueled to keep the domestic situation calm and growing. And I think that actually aligns more with US interests than most people realize. So they want to keep growing. They're not going to keep growing if they do anything too dramatic. If they try to blow up the world financial system, that's not good for their domestic economy, right? So interests are a little bit more aligned. And the reason I'm talking about that is if you look at Chinese foreign exchange reserves, they have the most of any country around the world. So they've got about, let's say, $3.5 trillion in reserves. $1.5 trillion of this is our debt. It's US Treasuries. Okay, so the reason I brought up the domestic situation to bring it full circle is there was a lot of fear, and I would expect it to uptick again, it ebbs and flows, about China selling its US Treasuries, right, dumping them on the market. They've got $1.5 trillion of them. If they were to do that, that would be colossally bad for the world financial system. So there was fear about this, and we were talking to clients and saying, we're not concerned because the lens we look at China is that they wouldn't want to do that because it doesn't serve their purposes of keeping the domestic economy growing, keeping Chinese citizens relatively happy with the status quo, and staying in power. So that's our view on China, a little bit different. I wanted to talk about oil and then trade also, because China's had a huge impact on the oil price. So this is what happened to oil, right? The price fell 70%. And similar to what Theo said, it's an oversupply issue. I just want to give you both sides of the coin about oil. So if the price of oil fell because of very, very weak demand, that would be worrisome. That would be a signal, a very bad signal, about the state of the global economy. That's not what we see. And you had a lot of people worrying that China was slowing, demanding less oil, and that's part of the reason the price fell. We don't see that. Demand is actually growing fine. It's quite robust. What you do see, though, is that there's been oversupply. So demand-supply curves from macroeconomics, if you look at production growth since 2013, global production has grown at 6%, whereas global consumption has grown closer to 4%. So obviously an imbalance of too much supply. Too much supply, price never adjusted, and when it finally did, it was dramatic. But we don't see this as a negative. We actually see it as a good thing. Now, if I was in Texas, I couldn't say that. I actually was in Texas giving a presentation, and I said, low oil is good for the consumer, and I effectively got booed off the stage because they don't want to hear that. But it is good for the consumer. And Theo mentioned it as well. We've seen the savings rate go up. And I don't have an issue with people not spending it, right? They're pocketing it or they're paying off debt. Either way, those are good things all around. So we would say low oil is a good thing, especially when it's driven by oversupply and not lack of demand. Nope. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about trade. Again, this is a political issue. So there was something that was really on the radar over the last year, the Import-Export Bank. I'm not sure if anyone's heard about it. It was going under the radar and then it would spike up in popularity. We're going to show you an interesting dashboard showing sentiment, but I just want to explain it because I think it's something we should know about. So trade is obviously a really important part of economic growth. And with economies starting to slow, you've seen a rise in rhetoric on protectionism. right? It seems very easy, build the wall, close the doors. We don't need to be importing things. We can make it ourselves. And obviously everyone in the room is probably wearing something or holding something that was not made in the US, and that's okay. But we've seen trade numbers start to fall. So normally trade runs twice the amount of global growth. So if global growth is running at 4, world trade will run at about 8. Now, again, big change since 2008. Global growth is running at about 3, and trade is running at about 2%. So that relationship is broken. And trade is going to be a big issue in the election. So I want to just mention the Import-Export Bank really quickly. It was made about 80 years ago by Congress. All different countries around the world have a form of an Import-Export Bank. And for those in the know, it's called the IMEX Bank, which I didn't know until a couple weeks ago. And the point of what the Import-Export Bank does is they provide loans, insurance, and financing to foreign companies to buy U.S. goods. So they basically help U.S. exporters by giving a loan to a German company to buy U.S. goods. Now, this disproportionately helps small companies, which I would say is a good thing. But it's very contentious among political candidates because it's the idea that the government is picking people to help that then supports specific companies. Right, so it's not really free market. I'm providing a better loan terms to that German company who then wants to buy, technology parts from a small company in North Carolina that's now getting an advantage over another company. So what happened? December of last year, Congress did not reinstate the Import-Export Bank. It blew up politically, and recently, as of this summer, they did reinstate it. But it's back up for renewal in 3 years, 2019. And we think it's an important issue just because it supports trade, and it's something that you might be hearing about in the news. So I'm going to let Tammy show us what kind of, public perception is about the Import-Export Bank.
Typically, when we're looking at these types of dashboards, part of what we're trying to understand is, is there an actual tone or sentiment around what people are saying? We use natural language processing on the back end. So when somebody says like, wow, this rocks, or, oh, this is sick, sometimes those things can get a little bit skewed. We find that a lot in the gaming industry and, again, with millennials. Luckily, with Export-Import, especially Export-Import Bank, that doesn't seem to be as much of a conversation starter around 18-year-olds. So in this sense, we're actually seeing things that are quite relevant in terms of what is everybody else talking about. And one thing I thought that would be interesting to note is, we talk a lot about millennials and the use of social media, things like that, but we'll also find, and oftentimes we're looking at things like this, where a lot of those conversations, both, again, in traditional media formats as well as in the social sphere, are happening by non-millennials, right? And so you get to see that more and more, especially as you start to look at some of these hot topics that are a little bit more removed from maybe the political world, or even just talking about what's happening around a debate, but starting to think more and more about, okay, what did the last month look like? What were we looking like a couple years ago? Talk about oil crises versus oil surplus and things like that, and you'll go even further into a slanting or a disposition around where people are talking about those things by state or by region. With this in particular, and again, apologies for some of the things that you might see on here. What we pulled in was just a word cloud that was really based off of how are people talking about these? What are the big keywords or mentions that are happening? X-IM, as Sam was talking about, very much resonating with everybody. A lot of the conversations that they're having are mentioning those types of things. But as you start to look a little bit deeper, you'll see that there are conversations around Hillary or Clinton, watchdog, nominee, Sundarbans. I clicked into that before, and it started, it showed me a story that was talking about tigers and trying to protect natural conservationists in parks and things like that. I didn't realize that was part of the larger story, but it's interesting to learn things like that. When we're looking at total mentions over time, we'll start to see that there are spikes that correlate with conversations that are happening or even debates and things like that. Whatever sort of hot topic is happening that seems to be resonating around the world, you'll often find that there are those peaks and valleys that are happening in the media world as well. And then we look down a bit further and we start to parse this data out not only by where is it coming from, but who are the top authors that are talking about this. So this is also helping understand maybe the person that I thought was most important and that I was focusing all of my time from a media perspective or outreach perspective is actually not that impactful when it comes to these types of conversations. We talk in the technology world a lot about Kara Swisher, who came, used to be at TechCrunch and then started Recode, and tends to be someone who, actually I've been acquired 6 different times by different companies, and she tends to tell me when I'm getting acquired before I even know, because she breaks that news so quickly. And so that's someone that I'm constantly following and trying to get a hold of and see sort of what big unicorn, if you will, is coming up next. Is she really? Supposed to be running for mayor. Yeah, I think she's fantastic. Maybe we can get her next year. But again, it's the sort of thing where I'll start looking at this data to understand, are the people that I think are the most impactful really that impactful or not? Same thing with news sources. So you'll start looking at where some of these news sources are breaking and recognizing, again, is more of this stuff happening because of the Washington Post, a traditional paper, or is it happening from the .com? Are they updating things on a more real, impactful timeline? And again, should I care or not? And so finally, we start to go down here and you'll start to see, again, all of these mentionings, and we start to parse them out by data source. So again, you'll oftentimes see, and that's one of the things we pride ourselves on, is that we work really closely with Twitter in addition to all of these other sources that are broadcast, .com, social video, YouTubes, etc. But oftentimes you'll see that Twitter is constantly dominating the conversation. So having to push in a little bit further to understand, just because it's got the most volume doesn't mean that it's the most impactful volume.
Great. The last topic we're going to discuss is 2 things I mentioned at the beginning that we are seeing being used for political purpose. So a large part of the election will probably rest on the domestic economy and the state of the domestic economy for the reasons I mentioned earlier, right, with that slower growth. And an important kind of subset under the umbrella of economic growth is the labor market, right, because that's what candidates are probably voted in about. And I want to just talk about the real state of the labor market. Have people heard mixed things about whether the job market is doing well or not? Okay. I want to highlight 2 numbers to you and talk a little bit about how jobs have been created. So the gray line up here is the unemployment rate. This is the headline unemployment rate you would see in USA Today, Wall Street Journal, CNN. This is what everyone talks about. And the unemployment rate fell from 10% in October of 2009 down to 5%. So it basically halved. And proponents of people who say that the labor market has done really well point to this number. And this does show progress. This is a positive. But I also look at a broader measure of the unemployment rate, which never seems to get too much press. So this is called the U3. We also look at the U6. The U6 is put out by the government, and it's more encompassing in terms of the people it counts. So it also includes part-time workers that would rather be working full-time. That's a measure of underemployment. And it also includes discouraged workers, which you've probably heard that term before. Workers who have looked and looked and looked for a job, unable to have found a job, they then fall out of the labor force. And maybe they do something for cash on the side, or they retire, or they stop working. But that's a form of underemployment as well. And when we look at that broader U6 measure, it paints a different picture, but with the same trend. So the U6, the broader measure, has fallen just as dramatically as this headline rate, but it fell from 19% down to 10. Okay, so kind of when we hear extremes that the labor market's doing really well or the labor market is doing terribly, based on this data, I would say it's probably somewhere in the middle. We've had a lot of progress, but we have a lot more room to go in terms of creating good jobs, the right types of jobs. And you've seen an upsurge in part-time employment, which is captured here, but you then survey those people, they don't want to be working part-time. So one other interesting thing to note, and this isn't a stance on government jobs or not, but normally after a recession, the government does step in and create jobs. And you've seen that every single expansion, except for the one we just had. So between 2010 and 2013, the government actually shed 900,000 jobs. Some were postal service, some were contract workers, some were military. But any way you cut it, they were not hiring. That was net. So on net, 900,000 jobs less. So this improvement has been pure private sector, which I think is very impressive considering it's different than every other expansion we've had. But that higher measure, which is the one I like to think about, is still close to 10, maybe it's 9.8. So more improvement needed. We're somewhere in the middle. Just a heads up for when you hear very extreme views on the labor market from different candidates. Last topic, again, on candidates, has to do with the federal debt. Who's worried about the federal debt? Okay. So the team had me write a paper on this because I'm Canadian, and I think they thought I wasn't going to be biased because they had some crazy views. And I was like, let me just get into the data and try to figure out what's going on. So again, what's the deal with the federal debt? You're probably going to hear extremes more on the end that it's completely unmanageable. In our view, it's elevated. It's not something we're positioning portfolios around. It's something we are not worrying about day to day, even with the big elephants in the room, which are Medicare and Social Security. So I'll talk about that in a second. Let's look at the debt holistically and then year to year, because I think this is an important thing to know. So this is total federal debt. These are accumulated deficits. And debt in the US is about 13 trillion. If you include debt that the government owes itself, right, pocket to pocket, because the Social Security has treasuries and that pensions have treasuries, it's closer to 17 trillion. Now, I say 17 trillion to you, that's a huge number, and there's no context around it. So that's, first of all, how I think politicians tend to talk about debt. And we think it's important to look at it as debt to GDP, right? Then you're putting it in perspective of something. How big is the economy? Because technically, if the economy is growing, it's okay to some extent if debt continues to grow. Your economy can handle it. So we look at debt to GDP, and currently it's 73%. That's kind of elevated. We normally averaged closer to 40, but I would say this isn't the highest we've ever had. Back after World War II, debt to GDP was 110. Secondly, how does debt detract from growth? What's the actual mechanism? It's the same way if you were to think about yourself as a consumer. Debt becomes a negative anchor on growth when the government has to spend more money servicing that debt, paying those interest payments versus productive resources of hiring people, R&D, education, services, right? So that's the divide. We don't see the debt exploding. And that's something you'll hear about. As interest rates start to go up, many have said, well, the debt's going to become unserviceable because the interest they're paying on the debt is going to go up. Even with interest rates doubling, which we don't think is going to happen, but even in that case, the deficit would only increase to about 85% total. And we really trust this data. It's bipartisan. It comes from the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which does fantastic forecasting of all this stuff. They're very trusted if you're really interested in getting kind of deeper into these issues. Talking about the debt on a yearly basis, right, that deficit we run every year, we've made a ton of improvements. Really proud. So you go back to 2008, we spent 10% more than we earned that year. That was the year of the financial crisis. That was the year of the $1 trillion emergency funding. 10% in a year is way too high. The magic number tends to be 3. So if you can spend 3% more than you take in, you're in generally okay financial shape if you're a government. I don't know if that applies to us. So now what's happened? This has come down dramatically. Year after year, we've taken in more tax revenue. We've helped to balance the budget to a better extent. We're now at about 2.5%. So not dire. We don't think the US government would ever default on its debt. ever. So it's not something we're worried about. You look at their assets versus their debt. They have 10 times more assets than they do as debt. I really like jewels, so I go to Washington to see the Hope Diamond. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Hope Diamond, but the government owns that, right? And they own tons of art. They own oil rights, mineral rights, land, gold. They own a lot, and they have 10 times more assets than they do debt. And I know it's a little wonky to think about, but realistically, they could liquidate some of those assets if they ever had to pay off their debt, even though there's no precedent of us doing that. And I don't want them to sell the Hope Diamond. But so where do we stand from a debt perspective? Definitely elevated, but not dire. Not going to blow up anytime soon, especially when you look at the forecasts, even with rising rates. And yes, we want to have less debt, but we don't think it should be the impetus for a candidate getting into power saying they're going to slash the debt to zero. It's okay to have debt to a certain extent. So I'm going to pause there. Tammy, are you showing candidate? Great. We're going to talk about candidates.
So luckily at Signal Labs, thank you both, we can talk about candidates all day long, and we do. If you come by our office here in San Francisco, you'll see we have what we call the Signal Command Center, but it's a wall of 6 different screens that is constantly looking at updating in real time hashtags, special words that Trump or Clinton or Sanders are talking about, even just looking at the massive amount of data and conversation that's happening around each of these candidates. I just took a quick snapshot here. This was just from the past week. And mind you, it's going just a little bit slower with the Wi-Fi here. But we've even done things around emoji clouds. So you start to see that there will be emojis, train sets and bombs and, sad faces and things like that. And oftentimes those are correlating to something that was just stated by one of the candidates or as a response to, oh my goodness, this is what's going to happen if we have X candidate as our next president. So we love it because it's just a great visualization. People tend to really see that resonates with them. And again, just looking at the type of breakdown that we have, you'll see that even just things in terms of top issues, right? This is not where we're coming up with these issues. We're just trying to take things that have been tagged a number of times and compartmentalize them. And you'll see, there's Mexico, there's hashtag never Trump. I didn't realize that had grown in such strength over the last couple of weeks, but we see it everywhere. Taxes, especially just coming off of tax season, that's resonating with everybody right now. Trade, as Sam was talking about, as well as just college and being able to pay for it. When we look at mentions, this is the sort of thing that you'll see us talking quite a bit about as well. Just because someone is the loudest and sometimes the angriest doesn't mean that they're the best candidate. So you'll see Trump constantly dominates conversations. That's been happening for the last 9 months. Jokingly, when our CEO, Josh Ginsburg, was first talking about putting something up at our office, we were all looking at it just in amazement going like, wow, Trump is really... There's a lot going on around him, right? He goes, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. just because there's mentions doesn't mean that really is going to correlate to anything. And every now and then we have to sit on our tails a little bit and say, okay, apparently this candidate did even more than we thought they would, right? And they were able to get that much more traction. So we consistently see this. And again, just because the mentions are, the volume is the loudest, we don't know just from looking at this, is all that volume really great, right? So there's a lot of things that are happening that are very anti-Trump, which brings that volume up even more. And then we can look at things like share of voice, and you'll start to see us, again, consolidating all this information to get a sense of how much conversation is happening around each of these candidates. And even to the bottom, just here, we talk about what are the trending stories, right? So the big thing that came out earlier this week was around Kasich and Cruz joining forces. No one's going to let Trump become the next candidate, GOP candidate. And so you'll see a lot of people are talking about that. Just in, at this moment, it was over 6,000 times that it was shared via tweet that originally stemmed from CNN. I thought this was really fun and very specific to what we've been talking about. But we also were trying to do a little side-by-side between Clinton and Sanders, right? So looking again at the breakdown, looking at the type of momentum and things that are happening, especially this was from earlier this week, but right after debates. We start to look at what types of stories are coming through. And again, even just looking at the word cloud. So how are people being talked about? So Clinton, there still seems to be a lot of conversation around Trump. Trump doesn't seem to, want to let go or give up that bite on talking about Hillary. Whereas everything that you'll see with Sanders is talking a bit more around this notion of revolution, socialism, really getting more to the millennial vote and things of that nature. And then we look at just how are things actually being share of voice within each of those mediums that we work with, right? So as a whole, between TV, .com, social, et cetera, Bernie's dominating, but not by much, right? 56 versus 44. Then with Twitter, you see that Bernie's done a much better job of just activating tweeters, but Hillary's still strong there. And so these are the sort of things that are helping really, our political teams as well, because we do have some customers who are political candidates, as well as Washington Post, and even just, again, like I was talking about earlier, Fortune 100 and 500 companies who know that their business is going to be impacted by the next president. So they're looking at these sort of things too. So I think if I can give you one takeaway, it's really just thinking about the notion that, oftentimes people are working with us not because they come in with one clear point of view of this is what they care about, and they do. They'll come to us and say, I'm only worried about X or Y. Then the more we start to talk to them and the more we start to really push on what are the hot buttons and hot topics for them, we start to realize that it goes beyond what maybe their immediate crisis or immediate need was, and goes into all of these other places that play into trade distribution, import, export, immigration, U.S. policy, as well as foreign policy, and, as diluted down to political candidacy. So thank you.
So because it's already running late, because we always seem to do that, we do want to answer and have some questions, but I want you guys to give both Sammy and Samantha a hand. Applause. And I'm giving them a little book here called Playing It Big, which some of you may remember, Tara Moore, from last year. And it's all about finding your inner strength, listening to yourself, not that horrible mommy noise that comes out sometimes that I've been trying to get rid of, and about growing and being a strong individual and going forward. So I wish you both tremendous success going forward in your careers. You guys are awesome.